The land Elias Kane had been given was the driest quarter section in the whole valley, and everyone in Marrow Creek knew it. And most of them said so to his face without much unkindness, only the flat certainty of people who had lived through enough seasons to trust their own eyes. What no one said, because no one else had reason to notice it, was the peculiar business of the clay pots. He found them the autumn his grandmother died, stacked 3 and 4 deep in the root cellar beneath a canvas gone stiff with dust, 41 of them by his count, each one squat and round-bellied, each one unglazed, each one stoppered at the neck with a disc of beeswax pressed in so tight it took a knife to work loose. They were not jugs for cider and not urns for grain. They held nothing. They had never held anything, so far as he could tell, and yet someone, his grandmother, surely, since it was her cellar in her hand that had wrapped each one in burlap before setting it down, had taken the trouble to seal them as carefully as she might have sealed a jar of preserves meant to outlast a winter. He did not ask anyone about them right away. That was not his way. He set one on the kitchen table and turned it under the lamp for the better part of an hour, running his thumb along the seam where the clay had been thrown thin near the base and left thick near the shoulder, an odd asymmetry for a vessel with no evident purpose. He noted, because he noted such things out of habit rather than urgency, that the clay was the coarse red kind dug from the creek bank 2 miles east, not the fine gray clay the potter in town used for his dishes and pitchers. He noted that every pot, all 41, had a small hole bored through the wax stopper no wider than a knitting needle, and that the holes had all been plugged again with a soft plug of tallow, easily removed, easily replaced. He set the pot back on its shelf and went about the evening chores, and if his wife had still been living, she would have said that was exactly like him, to find a mystery and fold it up quiet and carry it around in his coat pocket for a month before he said a word about it to a living soul. The land itself gave him plenty else to think about. It ran along Widow's Ridge, 320 acres of thin topsoil over a shelf of caliche that the well diggers cursed at and the county surveyor had marked, in the ledger book at the courthouse, with the single unhelpful word poor. His father-in-law had offered him the parcel 2 years back, after Elias had married the man's daughter Naomi and come out from the east with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and an uncommon patience that some mistook for slowness. The good bottomland along the creek had already gone to Naomi's brothers. The ridge was what remained, and Elias had taken it without complaint, the way he took most things, and set to building a cabin and a life on ground that everyone agreed would fail him inside 3 summers. Naomi's sister Sarah rode out from her own place most Sundays that first year, and it was Sarah who said, gently enough, that she worried for them up there, that the well gave up barely 11 feet of water even in a wet April, that the garden plot cracked open like a dropped plate by the first week of July most years. She did not say it to wound him. She said it the way a person says a thing they have turned over too many nights not to say it, and Elias only nodded and thanked her for her concern and went on digging post holes. It was in the spring of the second year, with the garden freshly turned and the beans not yet up, that he pulled his grandmother's notebook down from the shelf where it had sat untouched since her burial, meaning only to find her recipe for the salve she used to make for cracked hands. The notebook was thin, bound in board covers gone soft at the corners, and the pages inside were crowded with her small slanted hand, half in English and half in the Spanish she had picked up as a girl on a ranch near the Rio Grande before her family moved north. He turned past the salve recipe, past a page of chicken remedies, and came to a page headed, in letters larger than her usual hand, as though she had wanted whoever found it to slow down and read carefully, on the burying of water. The entry ran 3 pages. She had learned it, she wrote, from a woman named Refugio who kept a garden that never once failed in 11 years on a hillside drier than any Elias would ever farm. The principle, as Elias's grandmother set it down, was simple enough to state and demanding enough in its particulars that she had clearly tested it more than once before trusting the page. An unglazed clay pot, she wrote, will weep water slowly through its own walls into the soil around it, so long as the soil is packed close against the clay and the top is kept sealed against the sun. Buried to its neck beside the roots of a plant, filled full and stoppered, one such pot would give up its water not in an hour but across many days, seeping only so fast as the earth itself could draw it. never wasted to the air the way water flung from a bucket is half lost to evaporation before it ever reaches the roots. She had written numbers in the margin, cramped and underlined. A pot holding 2 gallons, buried 14 inches deep with its neck an inch above the soil, watering a circle of ground 3 feet across, would need refilling every 8 to 10 days in ordinary summer heat, rather than every single evening as a furrow-watered garden required. She had drawn a small, rough diagram of pots set in a staggered row down a bean trellis, each one shared between 2 plants. At the bottom of the last page she had written, in ink gone brown with age, a single line that Elias read 3 times before he closed the book. Refugio told me the pot does not water the plant. The pot teaches the plant patience, and the plant, in turn, teaches the ground. He did not fully understand that sentence for a long while. He understood the numbers better, and the numbers were what he acted on first. He dug 41 holes that week, 1 for each pot, spaced 3 feet apart down 2 rows flanking the bean trellis, and a shorter row beside the young squash hills, and he filled each pot from the well by bucket, 2 gallons exactly. Using a tin dipper he notched to measure it, and he pressed the wax stoppers back into the necks and covered the shoulders of each pot with soil tamped down by hand. Sarah came by on the Sunday after and stood at the fence looking at the rows of round clay necks poking up out of the dirt like something buried only halfway, and she asked him, not unkindly, whether he meant to dig up the whole garden come July looking for potatoes that were never planted. He told her what the notebook said. She looked at him the way she often did, with worry dressed up as patience, and said only that she hoped Grandmother Kane had known what she was about, because the well was already down 2 feet from where it stood the year before, and there was no water on Widow's Ridge to spend on an old woman's stories if the stories proved wrong. The first watering failed within 9 days, though it took Elias a little longer to understand that it had failed, or how. He had expected the beans nearest the pots to show it plainest, and they did, wilting at the very time the notebook promised they ought to be drawing steady moisture. He dug carefully around one pot to find the clay bone dry to the touch, no dampness in the soil beside it at all, as though the water inside had simply vanished. When he pulled the stopper, the pot was empty, and when he ran his hand along the outer wall he found, at the base where the clay had been thrown thinnest, a hairline crack no wider than a thread, through which the whole 2 gallons had likely drained out in a single day, straight down past the roots and into the caliche shelf where no plant could ever reach it. He went back to the cellar and examined the remaining pots one by one under the lamp, tapping each with a knuckle and listening for the note it rang, the way a man tests a wagon wheel for a hidden split. 11 of the 41 rang dull and flat where the others rang clear, and those 11 he set aside and used, understanding now what his grandmother must have meant by the peculiar shelf-thick, base-thin asymmetry he had noticed the very first evening. Not a flaw in the throwing, but a chosen thinness at the base to let water pass, and a chosen thickness at the shoulder to hold the pot's shape against the weight of packed earth. And any pot fired unevenly enough to crack along that thin base was worse than useless, since it would drain its water below the reach of any root in a single night rather than weeping it out over many days as intended. He reburied the 30 sound pots, refilled them, and marked a small board he nailed to the fence post at the head of the garden. A running tally he began that same evening and kept faithfully from then on. Date filled, gallons used, days until the soil beside each pot showed dry again. The first honest reading, 9 days after the correction, showed the ground beside pot 4 still faintly damp to 2 knuckles depth, and Elias stood over that small patch of moist black earth and ground that had cracked and curled everywhere else on the ridge, and he did not smile, because smiling was not much in his nature, but he took his hat off and stood there a moment longer than the task required. The chalkboard ledger he kept inside the cabin door told a harder story than the garden did that summer, because a garden can be nursed along on discipline while a household cannot be nursed on anything but what it has. He chalked the well level every 3rd morning, measured by a knotted rope let down the shaft, 11 feet in April, 8 feet by the last week of June, 5 feet 9 inches by the middle of July, a drop steady and merciless as a clock running down. He chalked the flour barrel in days remaining at present use, 61 days at the start of July, 44 by August, and Naomi began stretching each baking with cornmeal ground finer than she liked. because the wheat crop 2 counties over had failed entire, and prices in town had gone up past what most families could bear twice in one season. He chalked the cattle numbers on Sarah's place, because Sarah's husband had begun driving stock to whatever creek still ran, farther and farther each week, losing 2 head in the driving that he might have kept had the water been nearer. By late July, the whole valley had stopped calling it a dry spell and started calling it what the old men said they remembered from 40 years back and had hoped never to see again. The dust took on a particular color that summer, a pale gray yellow that hung low over the fields in the evenings even when no wind stirred it, and men who did not ordinarily speak of such things began to speak of it at the feed store, comparing the height of the creek against marks scratched into the mill's foundation stone in a drought their fathers remembered. It was in the first week of August that doubt came for Elias, not all at once, but the way water comes off a roof after rain has stopped, a slow persistent drip long after the storm itself has passed. He had begun to notice that even the sound pots were failing faster than the notebook promised, needing refilling at 6 days instead of 9, and he sat one evening at the kitchen table with his grandmother's notebook open before him and Naomi across from him mending a shirt by lamplight, and he said, more to himself than to her, that perhaps the ground here was simply too far gone for any method a woman had learned on a hillside in another country, that perhaps some land could not be coaxed, no matter how patiently a man worked it, and that he ought to pull the pots and save what water remained in the well for the animals and the house rather than pour it into holes in the dirt on the strength of an old woman's page. It was Naomi who talked him out of it, and she did it the way she did most things, through her hands rather than her words. She set down her mending, took the lamp, and walked out with him into the dark garden, and she knelt at pot 4, the first one that had ever shown him proof, and she dug her fingers into the soil at its base and held them up to the lamplight, so he could see the dampness still clinging there even on a 6th day rather than a 9th, drought or no drought. She said that the pots were not failing faster because the method was wrong, but because the ground around them was drier now than it had been in April, drawing harder on the reservoir the same way a thirstier man drinks faster from the same well bucket. The pots were doing exactly what they had always done. It was the world around them that had changed, and a method proven sound did not become unsound merely because the trial around it had grown harder. Elias sat back on his heels in the dark a long moment, and then he stood, and he did not speak of pulling the pots again. The dog complicated things in a way neither of them had accounted for. Salt was a rangy yellow cur that had wandered onto the place the winter before and stayed on the strength of table scraps and Naomi's soft heart. And Salt had taken, that first hot July, to digging at the buried pot necks whenever the ground nearby went to mud from a careless overfill, working his forepaws into the damp earth with the single-minded joy of an animal who has found the one cool, wet patch in 300 acres of baked clay. He unearthed 2 pots outright before Elias caught him at it, cracking one against a stone in his digging, and Elias took to driving a ring of sharpened lath stakes around each pot's crown, close enough together to turn the dog's paws, but wide enough to let a man's hand through for the refilling. Barley, the gelding, gave his own trouble at the well itself, shying and sidestepping whenever Elias drew water at dusk, ears pinned back toward the sound of the rope creaking against the pulley, and it took some weeks before Elias understood the horse had simply learned to dread the sound as a herald of thirst rather than relief. The well drawing harder and slower with every passing week until even the animal could hear the difference in the pitch of the rope. The first of the 3 came to the door in the 2nd week of August. Ezra Colton farmed the section due west of Widow's Ridge, a man who had said little to Elias beyond a nod at church in 2 years of neighboring. And he came at dusk leading a wagon with 3 barrels in the bed, and he stood at the door turning his hat in his hands before he could bring himself to ask it plain. His well had gone to mud that morning, nothing left to draw. And could Elias spare water enough to see his own family and 2 milk cows through a week while he dug a second well down toward the creek bed? Elias gave him what he could from the cistern, not from the garden pots, but he walked Ezra out past the bean rows on the way back to the wagon, and Ezra stood a long moment looking at the staggered clay necks ringed in lath stakes, at beans still hanging heavy and green in ground that ought by rights to have burned to stubble weeks before, and he asked, quiet, whether a man might come look at that notebook sometime, if it wasn't too much to ask. Elias said it wasn't. The second came 10 days after that. Mabel Foss had been widowed the winter past and kept her 3 children and a half-acre garden on the strength of what she could grow and what the church took up in collection, and her garden had failed entire by the first week of August, the squash vines gone to gray paper, and the corn stunted knee-high and tasseled early from thirst. She did not come to ask for water. She came, having heard from Ezra Colton's wife at the store, to ask whether Elias would teach her boy, who was 11 and strong enough to dig, how the clay pots were made and buried, so that she might try it herself on what remained of the season and be readier for the spring after, whatever the spring after brought. Elias spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon showing the boy how to test a pot for the false ring of a hidden crack, how deep to set it, how to pack the soil close against the clay walls so no pocket of air might slow the seep. The boy filled his own mother's first 4 pots from a borrowed barrel that same evening, careful with the tin dipper the way he had been shown, and Mabel Foss stood at her fence afterward with her arms crossed over her apron, watching the last light go down over ground she had nearly given up on, saying nothing at all, which from a woman who had buried a husband that winter was its own kind of thanks. The third came in September, and it was the Reverend Isham Pratt from the church in town, who kept the seed stores for the county relief fund in the storehouse behind the mill, and who came not for water, but for knowledge of a different kind. The relief fund had seed corn and bean seed enough, he said, to replant every failed garden in the valley come spring, so long as the seed itself did not go to rot or weevil sitting through a long dry storage, and so long as whatever few seedlings men managed to start early in a poor spring could be kept alive through the kind of dry snap that had ruined this year's plantings before the summer rains, if they ever came at all, could be counted on. He had heard, from 3 separate households now, of a method of buried clay that kept a garden alive on less water than any furrow or bucket required, and he asked whether Elias would be willing to come speak of it before the relief committee, so that whatever families took seed from the county stores that spring might also take with them the means to keep what they planted alive. Elias said he was no speaker. The Reverend said that was Cain's own opinion of himself and not likely to be shared by anyone who had watched his garden all summer from the road. The rains that ended the worst of it did not come until the 3rd week of October, and even then they came thin and grudging at first, a slow soaking rain rather than the kind that runs off hard ground in useless sheets, the kind of rain the ground on Widow's Ridge could finally, after 5 months of careful clay-top patience, actually take in and hold. Elias chalked the well level that morning for what would be the last time that year. 6 feet 4 inches, rising for the first time since April. He did not cheer. He stood at the fence a while with Naomi beside him, watching the rain come down soft and steady over rows of bean plants that had somehow, against every prediction the county surveyor had ever written down about that quarter section, carried a harvest through the driest season the valley had seen in 40 years. By the last week of November the garden was turned under for winter, the pots lifted, cleaned, and stacked back in the cellar wrapped in fresh burlap the way his grandmother had left them, all save the 11 cracked ones, which Elias broke apart entirely and buried as shard and grit at the base of the fence posts, where he said the clay might still do some good, holding moisture for the fence line even in pieces. The chalkboard by the door he did not wipe clean. He left the last season's tallies standing through the winter, the long column of dates in gallons and days, because Naomi said a man ought to be able to look at his own doorframe and see the whole hard shape of what had been gotten through, not just remember it in pieces the way memory likes to soften a thing over time. 3 families planted buried clay that following spring on Elias Cain's word and his grandmother's notebook, copied out by the Reverend's own hand into 4 fair copies for the relief committee's use, and in the spring after that, 7 more. Elias never claimed to have invented a thing. He said, when men asked him at the store how he had known to trust an old woman's page against the word of every well-digger and surveyor in the county, only that his grandmother had understood something about ground and water that took most men a whole ruinous season to learn for themselves, that the earth does not yield to force, however desperate, but only to a patience laid down early and kept faithfully, one small buried vessel at a time, long before any man can see what it will come to.